Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a deep plunge into, well, a truly monumental piece of legislation that's been all over the headlines, the big, beautiful bill.
That's right. It's this package President Trump has talked about, saying it'll make the country an economic rocket ship.
Exactly, and calling it the biggest bill of its kind ever signed. Pretty bold claims.
And that's really what this deep dive is for. We're going to unpack this incredibly comprehensive package for you.
Yeah, we'll be pulling insights directly from the official text, budget analyses from places like the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office, NerdWallet, factcheck.org, news outlets.
Basically all the key sources. Our goal is to distill the most important information, help you understand what's actually in this bill.
And its projected impact, right? What could it mean for your daily life?
Precisely.
So our mission today, to guide you through these huge changes, defense, the economy, social policies, you name it. This isn't just a summary. It's about getting you really informed on something that could reshape things for years.
Okay, so let's get into it. This bill, it's monumental. When we say comprehensive, we mean it. It touches, well, nearly every aspect of federal policy.
It's not just like one single issue. It's designed as a cohesive package tackling a whole bunch of stuff at once.
Exactly. And this One Big Beautiful Bill Act, as it's been called, it really represents a major budget and policy overhaul. Its reach is incredibly broad.
Covering areas usually handled by lots of different committees, right? Armed services, banking, commerce.
Energy, finance. The list goes on. It's definitely not your typical bill. It's intended to sort of reset a lot of federal priorities.
Okay, so with something this big, the huge question is the money. What's the projected impact on the national debt, the federal deficit?
Yes. And this is where things get, well, complicated.
Yeah.
The numbers tell a complex story, and the interpretations really differ.
How so?
Well, you've got the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. They project a pretty significant increase, $3.8 trillion in the federal deficit over 10 years.
$3.8 trillion. Wow.
Yeah, and they mainly attribute that to the tax changes in the bill. NerdWallet reports something similar, about a $3.3 trillion addition to the national debt.
But the White House has a different take.
Completely different. They're claiming the bill will actually reduce the deficit by $1.4 trillion.
Okay, hold on. Increase by $3.8 trillion versus decrease by $1.4 trillion. That's a massive difference. How is that even possible?
It really boils down to different accounting methods. The big sticking point is how they treat the extension of the 2017 tax cuts.
Okay. Explain that a bit.
So think of it like this. Are you budgeting for your current expenses to continue, or are you only counting new spending? The CBO often treats extending expiring tax cuts as effectively new spending or lost revenue.
Because if they weren't extended, taxes would go up, so keeping them low-cost money the government would have otherwise collected.
Exactly. From their perspective, choosing not to collect that potential revenue adds to the deficit compared to letting the cuts expire.
But the White House sees it differently.
Right. They, and supporters of the bill, tend to view these extensions as current policy. Their argument is, look, these rates have been in effect. Continuing them isn't a new cost. It's just stopping a tax hike.
So it depends if your starting point, your baseline, assumes the cuts expire or continue.
Precisely. That's the core of the accounting difference.
Okay. Beyond the big deficit numbers, did the CBO look at specific programs, social programs maybe?
They did. They project some really significant changes there. For instance, they estimate about $698 billion less in federal subsidies from Medicaid over 10 years.
Less from Medicaid.
And $267 billion less in federal spending for SNAP, the Food Assistance Program.
Okay. And states pick up the slack.
That's part of it. The CBO also projects about $78 billion in additional state spending on MET. That reflects states having to contribute more as the federal share for these programs goes down. It's a definite shift in fiscal responsibility.
Wow. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Here's where it gets really interesting for your personal finances. Taxes. This bill makes some pretty big changes to the tax code, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This is central. And according to analyses, the most expensive single item in the budget is making those 2017 tax cuts permanent.
So instead of expiring, they just stay.
That's the plan.
Yeah.
It's meant to provide, long-term certainty for taxpayers.
Okay, give us some specifics. What kind of cuts are we talking about?
Well, the standard deduction, that amount you can deduct right off the bat, that increases by $750 for single filers and $1,500 for married couples filing jointly.
And that alone costs
That one change is estimated to reduce federal revenue by about $1.425 trillion over 10 years. That's huge.
Okay, what else?
The child tax credit also gets a permanent boost, up to $2,200 per child starting in 2026. That's projected to cost around $817 billion.
Right.
And the exemptions for the estate and gift taxes on very large inheritances or gifts, those are also permanently increased and extended. So more wealth can be passed on tax-free.
So, okay, these sound like broad cuts, but the crucial question for you listening is, who really benefits the most? Is it spread evenly?
That's a really important point. Independent analyses suggest, yeah, on average, taxpayers in all income groups see some relief. And this is a big...
But not evenly distributed.
Not at all. Those with the highest incomes are projected to get the biggest benefit by far. We're talking average savings potentially around $12,000 a year for the wealthiest household.
Okay, and middle-income folks.
Middle-income families,
Yeah.
maybe $500 to $1,000 a year on average. But here's a really key finding from one CBO analysis NerdWallet cited.
Uh-oh.
The lowest income households could actually see a net loss, an average loss of about $1,559 annually.
A loss? How?
Well, it's likely a combination of factors. The tax changes might not benefit them as much, and then you factor in the potential impact of cuts to programs they might rely on, like Medicaid or SNAP. So it fundamentally reshapes things, with the biggest gains really concentrated at the very top.
That's quite a contrast. Are there other, maybe more specific new deductions we should know about, things that might hit closer to home for individuals?
Yes, there are a few interesting ones, kind of targeted. For the tax years 2025 through 2028, there's a provision for no federal tax on tips or on overtime pay.
Okay, that's big for service workers and people working extra hours.
Definitely. And there's a new deduction specifically for seniors, $6,000 for individuals, $12,000 for married couples, again for 2025 to 2028.
And that has a big impact.
Apparently so. FactCheck.org noted it's significant enough that it could mean something like 88% of seniors wouldn't pay federal taxes on their Social Security income. A clear appeal to that demographic.
Interesting. Anything else surprising?
Well, maybe this. Interest paid on auto loans for new vehicles, up to $10,000 of interest, is excluded from federal tax also for 2025 through 2028. It seems like an incentive for new car buying.
Okay, so mostly tax cuts, but are there any measures that actually increase federal revenue, bring more money in?
There are a couple, though maybe less broad. One is the SALT deduction cap. That's state and local taxes. The bill increases the cap on how much you can deduct to $40,000.
Wait, increasing the cap raises revenue. How does that work?
Well, it's a bit counterintuitive. By raising the cap from its previous lower level, it allows some higher income people in high-tax states to deduct more than before, but it's still a cap. The overall effect, compared to no cap at all or a much higher one, is projected to increase federal revenue by about $946 billion. It limits the total amount of state-local tax deductions overall.
Ah, okay. That makes more sense.
Yeah.
What else brings in revenue?
A big one is ending the residential clean energy tax credit after 2025. So those credits homeowners could get for things like rooftop solar or geothermal heat pumps, those go away. That's estimated to save, or rather bring in, about $77 billion because the incentive spending stops.
Got it. No more solar credit after 2025.
And then there's something pretty unique. A new tax, 31.8% on the profits made by third-party litigation funders.
Litigation funders, what's that?
It's an industry where outside investors basically fund lawsuits, hoping for a cut of the settlement. This tax targets the money those investors make. It's tapping into a specific, newer financial area.
Huh, okay. Anything else really specific?
One really niche detail,
Yeah.
The federal tax on transferring or making certain firearms, not machine guns, but others, gets slashed dramatically. From $200 down to just
$2 from
Yeah.
$200.
A very specific change, clearly aimed at gun owners and collectors.
Okay, let's pivot now. Two other huge areas in this bill, national security and energy. These really seem to sketch out a vision for America's place in the world and its resource strategy.
Oh, absolutely. The bill pumps a truly massive amount of money into the Department of Defense DoD. We're talking a $1 trillion allocation just for
$1
defense.
trillion, that's a statement.
It is. And it's not just maintaining the status quo. It's about significantly strengthening military power.
Where's that money going? Any examples?
Sure. There's $4.6 billion for a second Virginia-class submarine in fiscal year 2026, another $5.4 billion for 2 more guided missile destroyers. These are huge investments in the Navy.
So building up sea power.
Definitely. And the bill also focuses on the industrial base behind it, funding for expanding manufacturing, especially for shipbuilding. It's not just buying ships. It's making sure we can build them efficiently long term.
Right, shoring up the foundations, not just the final product. That makes sense strategically. What else in defense?
There's a big emphasis on integrated air and missile defense. Very important these days.
Like what?
Well, $5.6 billion for space-based interceptors trying to stop threats from space, $7.2 billion for military sensors in space for tracking and intelligence, and $2 billion for hypersonic defense systems.
Hypersonics. That's cutting-edge stuff.
It is. And related to that, there's also a focus on supply chains. $4.2 billion specifically to boost the U.S. stockpile of critical minerals.
Minerals needed for what? Defense tech? Electronics?
Both. Exactly.
Yeah.
Securing those supplies is seen as a national security issue.
Okay, and how does all this defense spending connect with border security? That's often linked in these discussions.
It connects directly. The bill allocates $1 billion for using military personnel to support border operations. That includes counter-drug missions and even temporary migrant detention on military bases.
So a more militarized approach at the border.
That seems to be the direction. And NerdWallet mentioned even larger figures specifically for border control, $45 billion for the U.S.-Mexico border wall itself, and another $45 billion for immigration detention facilities.
$45 billion for the wall and another $45 for detention. Those are enormous numbers, really underlining the priority placed on border control.
Huge commitment, yes.
Okay, shifting from defense to energy, the bill seems to signal a pretty major change in direction there, too.
A very profound shift, yes.
Yeah.
It's characterized by, well, widespread deregulation and rolling back many parts of the Inflation Reduction Act from 2022.
Rolling back recent climate policies.
Significantly. It's a clear move away from those priorities and a strong emphasis back towards fossil fuel production.
How so? What does it actually mandate?
It mandates, for example, the immediate resumption of quarterly onshore oil and gas lease sales. And it requires offering at least 50% of the available nominated areas.
So opening up more federal land for drilling.
And offshore, too. It mandates at least 30 large offshore lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico, plus at least 6 offshore sales up near Alaska, in the Cook Inlet area. Very aggressive targets for expanding domestic extraction.
Wow. And there's funding, too.
Oh, yes. A massive $1 trillion appropriation for something called energy dominance financing.
Energy dominance financing.
Yeah, it's specifically to support projects that boost energy capacity or output and improve grid reliability, clearly favoring traditional fossil fuel-based energy sources.
Now, proponents claim this will, quote, unleash clean American-made energy and lower costs. Do the analyses back that up, especially the cost part for households?
Well, that's a major point of debate.
Yeah.
While that's the claim, some independent analyses actually project household energy costs could increase, not decrease.
Increase. Why?
Well, one nonpartisan group, Energy Innovation, estimated an average increase of about $170 in annual energy costs per household by 2035 compared to current policy. Another group, the Repeat Project, put that figure potentially as high as $284.
So the opposite of the stated goal, why would costs go up?
It's likely due to things like winding down the incentives for cheaper, clean energy and maybe locking in reliance on fossil fuels whose costs might fluctuate or rise long term.
And what about those clean energy tax credits? Are they just gone, or are there new rules?
There are new restrictions. For wind and solar projects, for instance, companies could be denied credits if they're deemed a specified foreign entity or under foreign influence, trying to keep control domestic.
Okay.
And there are also new requirements about where materials come from, domestic content rules, and cost ratios related to assistance, basically pushing for more American-made components and manufacturing.
Which sounds good for jobs, but could it make those projects more expensive or slower to build initially?
That's the potential trade-off, yes. It could increase upfront costs and maybe slow deployment compared to using global supply chains.
Okay. So we've covered taxes, defense, energy. What about the social safety net? What does this bill mean for programs like Medicaid, SNAP, things many Americans rely on?
This is another area with really significant, potentially profound changes. Let's start with Medicaid. The CBO projects, as we mentioned, huge cuts, about $930 billion over 10 years.
$930 billion. It's almost $1 trillion cut from Medicaid. What does that mean in practice?
Well, it involves things like a new national work requirement. Childless adults and even parents with kids aged 15 and up would generally need to work, volunteer, or be in school for 80 hours a month to qualify.
80 hours a month. And more checks.
Yes, states would have to check eligibility every 6 months. That adds administrative hurdles and could lead to people losing coverage, even if technically eligible.
And the overall impact on the number of uninsured.
The estimate is stark,
Right.
potentially 11.8 million more people uninsured by 2034 because of these Medicaid changes.
11.8 million. That's a staggering number. Are there other major policy shifts in healthcare, maybe related to politically sensitive issues?
Yes, definitely. The bill includes a very explicit ban on using federal Medicaid or CHIP funds for specified gender transition procedures.
A federal funding ban. Are there exceptions?
Very narrow ones. Things like treating precocious puberty or certain medically verifiable disorders of sex development or fixing physical harm from a previous procedure, but generally a ban on federal funds for those procedures.
Okay. Anything else along those lines?
Yes. It also prohibits federal Medicaid payments going to what it calls prohibited entities.
And how are those defined?
They're defined basically as 501c3 nonprofits mainly involved in family planning or reproductive health that also provide abortions.
So organizations like Planned Parenthood, potentially?
That seems to be the target, yes. Again, there are very limited exceptions for rape, incest, or to save the life of the mother, but it fundamentally changes federal funding for those kinds of reproductive health services.
Okay. What about SNP, the Food Assistance Program?
Similar themes there. Tighter eligibility rules, expanded work requirements, much like with Medicaid, and, crucially, a big cost shift to the states.
How much of a shift?
The federal share of the cost is set to decrease down to just 25% by fiscal year 2027. That puts a much bigger financial burden on state budgets to maintain food assistance levels.
Wow, only 25% federal funding eventually. And student loans. Any changes there?
Significant changes. The bill essentially replaces the existing repayment plans, which could extend the time it takes for loan forgiveness for many. It also eliminates federal funding for the Grad PLUS loan program.
Grad PLUS, that lets graduate students borrow up to the full cost of attendance, right?
That's the one. Eliminating that funding is a big deal. And it also puts a new cap on the total amount a graduate student can borrow over their lifetime. These will definitely impact higher education financing.
It's just fascinating how incredibly broad but also incredibly specific some of these changes are, reaching into corners you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Exactly. And beyond those huge areas, there are other interesting bits that paint a fuller picture. For instance, funding for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, cut by half.
Half the funding for the consumer watchdog. That suggests a move towards less financial regulation.
That would be the implication, yes. But then, conversely, there's a lot of money for space exploration.
Oh, like what?
Almost $10 billion, $9.995 billion.
Yeah.
Technically for NASA's Mars plans, the Artemis moon missions, the whole Moon to Mars program, including developing a second commercial lunar lander.
So cutting consumer protection but boosting space exploration shows clear priorities.
It does. There's also investment in air traffic control, building a new control center, closing or consolidating at least 10 older ones, modernizing that infrastructure.
Okay.
And then just to show how specific legislation can get, there's even a provision creating a charitable deduction for expenses related to Native Alaskan subsistence whaling.
Subsistence whaling, really?
It highlights how these massive bills often contain very niche items alongside the huge policy shifts.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive makes it crystal clear. The big, beautiful bill is, well, it's massive. It's transformative. It really embodies some significant conservative policy goals.
Absolutely. It aims to reshape, well, almost everything. Defense spending, energy production, the social safety net, your taxes.
It's a huge fiscal commitment, as we discussed. There's a clear intent to roll back recent climate policies and a very strong push to boost the military and domestic energy, especially fossil fuels.
It's not just tinkering around the edges. It's designed to fundamentally realign federal priorities based on a specific vision.
And it's projected to have really far-reaching consequences, right, across the economy, society, from your tax bill to whether certain services are available. So here's a final thought for you to consider. Given the bill's stated goal ushering in an America's golden age with historic economic growth, through all these changes, how might these massive shifts in federal priorities, from energy dominance to rethinking social services, how might they actually redefine the balance between individual responsibility and societal support in the years ahead? And what could that mean for the fabric of American life?